All right, what's up, Period 5? This is Friday, 10/4. I'm out for Gulf State Finals. Really, really simple day. Follow along. I'm going to take you through the back half of Chapter 11. I'm going to have a couple tasks for you that you can kind of choose from when you finish this. There's two videos. I do want you to stop and watch those. Missouri Compromise, McCulloch versus Maryland. Those are two really big terms. And if you haven't picked up on this already, when I show a video, 90% of the time it's me emphasizing something I think is extra critical for a chapter. I'm not usually just picking out videos like, I just feel like showing this kind of thing. I do believe we have a bus evacuation drill today, if the sub didn't mention that, so you guys will be getting out of here at 2:40 on a Friday, which I'm sure no one will complain about. Email me if you have any questions. Assuming that you found this video, everything on Canvas is fine. Okay. Between 1791, so basically after the ratification of the Constitution, up until the 1820s, 9 states, so you have the original 13, so that's going to get us to about 22, are going to join the United States. Not the West that we would know today, but states like in Ohio and Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee. I'll have a map on the next slide. So America's growing. You get the idea. Now, the ever-present issue of slavery, it was just, I mentioned this in the Revolution Unit, it's getting kicked down the road, okay? And as these states enter the Union, kind of strategically speaking, not kind of, strategically, these states were entering free and slave back and forth to keep the equilibrium equal. Now, why are people moving out west? It's partially, at least for the time, the East Coast is getting filled up. It's getting crowded. Some of their farmland on the East Coast has experienced land butchery since the colonial time period. Natives are beginning to be wiped out and are continuing to be wiped out. I talked about the East is clogged, at least for the standards of the time. And then you also have like national roads, like the Cumberland Road being created. I think it was funding through the Jefferson administration that started this, and it was built over time. You can see it cuts through parts of present-day Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. Also, and this is the first of several, in the 1800s, there's a lot of land acts and opportunities to purchase land at dirt cheap rates from the federal government, like the Land Act of 1820. This allowed buyers, if they were willing to purchase 80 acres at $1.25, to basically, they had to pay straight up. You couldn't do it on credit because it's something I'm going to talk about in the next slide. And a lot of people to get land out west. Most of the time in history, you don't want to go back in time and live there for obvious reasons. But if there's one thing that would be nice about living in past United States history time periods, would be how darn easy it was to acquire land. These days, buying a small 1,200 square foot home is like a $250,000 ordeal with tons of competition for it. But they're just handing out land like candy back in these times. Couple visuals for you. You can see the statehood entrance year, and you can tell, if you look in that lightish pink, 1803, 1816, 1818, 1792, Kentucky, Tennessee, 1796. The other thing on the left is you can tell that our population, probably unsurprisingly to you, is absolutely going to explode after 1820. It's not even 10 million yet. And then basically every 20 years, you're going to have a doubling or like a 50% increase for the rest of the century. More states, more problems. America's growing. Okay, Panic of 1819. This is going to be a financial panic, not like a panic, chaos, riot sort of thing. First national financial panic in American history. Basically, the first time there was a significant hit to the American economy. And what this is going to cause is a lot of deflation. So dollars hard to acquire, but they're worth more. A lot of bankruptcies, bank failures, farm foreclosures, things like that. And the biggest reason, and there's going to be financial panics like every 20 years in the 1800s, and a lot of times the root of it's the same reason, is overinvestment, over speculation of frontier land out west, which in layman's terms means people were buying it on credit. With the assumption that their land would grow in value and things like that. That can be a very, very dangerous thing. And I won't go into modern economics, but when you're buying things on margin, that can be very, very risky. And that's why that Land Act thing I talked about from 1820 forced people to purchase from the government straight up with the money because too many people were buying on credit. So lots of effects. Number one, this is going to create the first major financial challenge for our national bank. If you can remember, that's what sparked political parties. That was a baby of Hamilton in the 1790s. Also, there's a lot of banks out in these western states, sometimes referred to as wildcat banks, that had very sketchy credit, were on very rocky foundation. They were disassociated with the national bank. They were like backed by only state governments, obviously very new state governments. And a lot of times in these financial panics, they were forced to close their doors. The East Coast banks would call the wildcat banks for loans and things like that, and it created a lot of financial hardship. A lot of foreclosures happened on western farms. And these wildcat banks got a kind of an untrustworthy label, but then also western farmers started to hate the East Coast elite financial bank, kind of old school Federalist types that they felt were their policies and ways of seeing the world went against their way of life out west. Is that my last bullet? Oh, one more. Because of this financial panic and the over speculation of land, the amount of debtors increased across the nation, which at least back then, being in debt was a serious offense and something you want to avoid like the plague. Nowadays, everybody has student loan debts and credit card debts and car loans and personal loans and HELOCs, and it's just a complete mess. Side note, guys, if you can avoid being in debt when you get into your 20s and stuff like that, you can be such a leg up financially from the rest of America and get rich really quick. But I digress. Debtors increase nationally due to the financial panic of 1819. Is going to create economic problems moving forward. Okay, let's talk about slavery and the Missouri Compromise, kind of the first major thing with this topic in the 19th century. So the states in the North are outgrowing the states in just terms of population, not just pure population, really since the writing of the Constitution into the 1820s. And as I've mentioned several times, the issue of slavery is well known. It's being addressed, but it's being addressed in a, well, let's kick it down the curb, the next generation will handle it kind of way. Half measures are being taken. There's a Vine, if anybody even remembers what that was. I can't, there's too much language in it, but the guy putting the French fries in a boiling hot pan, starts catching on fire, and he puts the lid over it, and he just starts screaming and cussing afterwards. That's kind of what early American policies at the federal level were with slavery. We're just going to kind of do something, put the lid over it, and then just hope it doesn't boil up and start a fire, and obviously eventually it's going to boil up and start a fire. The advantage the South is hanging on to, though, is that they have 2 senators per state. Again, the Constitution matters, guys. Those 2 senators per state is allowing them in Congress to be able to still have a very strong voice, despite the fact that in the House of Representatives, there is more representation up north. And then you also have to remember the 3/5 compromise that's getting Southerners extra reps in D.C. Now, fast forward, 1820, Missouri is looking to enter the Union as the odd number state number 23. And then there's also this thing getting passed around in Congress called the Tallmadge Amendment that was hoping to slow down slavery in Missouri, which was practiced there. I think they wanted kids of slaves to be born into freedom, no new slaves to enter the area, so to restrict the thing. And Southerners were really worried. They thought that would be the tip of the iceberg that would start the snowball effect for slavery to end permanently. And the Tallmadge Amendment, because of the strength in numbers in Congress from the South, does not get through. But this Missouri becoming a state thing, that is going to rear its ugly head a little bit, which is where you get the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Quotes left and right from our 4th and 5th presidents. James Monroe even saying an existing evil he recognizes slavery to be. John Quincy Adams, who never himself owned a slave, I have concluded that no action of mine can in the present state of things contribute to the abolition of slavery. So you have the 6th president, the most powerful man allegedly in the United States, saying, hey, slavery is wrong and bad. I can't really do anything about it in the 1820s. Make sure we watch the Missouri Compromise video. It's short, but this is a really key study guide term. It will be referenced in chapters and units to come. Possibly, probably more practically speaking, it could come up on your 10, 11, and 12 reading quiz. So stop, watch this, and then come back to me. All right, post video. Let's talk about John Marshall, who oftentimes has middle schools and different things named after him. He's Chief Justice, the head Supreme Court judge of the Supreme Court from basically the first three decades and change of the 1800s. He's not the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. John Jay was. I think there might be one in between. He's the first one of real significance and influence, though. Okay, and of course he's justice during Marbury versus Madison. So let's talk about a couple of cases where he's going to start setting a precedent with his Supreme Court. First and most importantly is going to be McCulloch versus Maryland in 1819. And basically what happens is the state of Maryland attempts to tax, this is crazy, a state tries to put a tax on the U.S. National Bank. Okay, so the U.S. National Bank, Hamilton's baby, they have a branch in Maryland, and the state government of Maryland says, we're going to tax the freaking national bank that is set up in our state borders. And the Supreme Court nixes this, but the decision, kind of like Marbury versus Madison, what it sets up is more important, okay? Basically, through this ruling, the Supreme Court and Marshall declare that the national bank has legal standing to be in the states, okay? And this goes all the way back to Hamilton versus Jefferson stuff, but the Supreme Court is basically backing the idea here, guys, that you can interpret the Constitution. Things don't have to be written word for word in pen or blood for the U.S. government to do things legally. So national bank is never written in the Constitution, but with this ruling, the Supreme Court is saying, hey, you can interpret things, and the idea or concept of a national bank was interpreted through the Constitution, but that is okay. So federal government won under John Marshall, and state governments or states' rights 0, and that score is only going to get worse. For example, in Cohen's versus Virginia in 1821, is it a brothers or family or something like that? They're trying to sell lottery tickets in Washington, D.C. And Virginia, the state of Virginia, had lottery tickets banned, but at the federal level, you could sell lottery tickets. So there's a suit, and the Supreme Court comes in. I don't even really remember what gets decided with the lottery tickets themselves. I don't know if they could sell them moving forward. But what Marshall's court does here is they say that the Supreme Court can intervene or overrule or look over state decisions. In this case, Virginia's decision not to allow lottery tickets, and I think moving forward they say federally, hey, you can't actually sell lottery tickets. So if you're keeping track at home, John Marshall's Supreme Court case example is federal government asserting their authority to state governments, 0. Number 3, Gibbons versus Ogden, all has to do with transportation rights with steamboats in New York. Okay, really exciting stuff on a Friday, I know. I think Gibbons had a license to use his steamboats from the federal government across states, and Ogden had a New York state license. But you can probably guess by now, the Supreme Court will side with Gibbons and say that federal license supersedes or overrides the New York license that Ogden had. It all had to do with where they could move their steamboats and what states they could interact and trade with. Again, details don't really matter in this. What matters is Marshall is establishing that federal government and policy is superior to, he's creating a hierarchy, is superior to individual state governments. In this case, New York, but obviously Virginia and Maryland in the examples before. Second video, I know they're kind of sandwiched here in the middle. Watch McCulloch versus Maryland. If there's one you want to know, I would say that one is, with all the strict, loose interpretation stuff, McCulloch versus Maryland, really big deal. All right, now that you've watched that, one more Marshall Court example, Fletcher v. Peck. You probably guessed what the end result of this story is going to be, but this is down south. So the state of Georgia legislature granted some companies, it was very, very sketchy, 35 million acres in land, what we would know as Mississippi today. There were a lot of bribes involved, and then, surprise, surprise, in the Yazoo lands, a lot of that was actually previously owned and controlled by natives. Tales old as time there. Now, Georgia, this gets exposed that this land was sold off in very sketchy, corrupt means, but there was a contract made, and Georgia tried after the fact to strip the lands that they had given away through corruption after the fact. The Supreme Court in Marshall steps in 1810 and basically says, hey, contract's a contract, may have been on sketchy means, but that needs to be honored, and they protect property rights with this. But once again, it's the Supreme Court coming in from D.C. superseding a decision that Georgia is making down there and ruling over it. If you are not picking up the trend I'm trying to describe with the John Marshall Court, it is that Marshall's legacy, starting with Marbury versus Madison, is that he established a precedent that the federal government and federal courts are going to be superior than individual state governments, and that the Supreme Court can come in, and if there's issues in the states, they can make judgments on those rulings. And perhaps maybe in the 21st century, there's been rulings on things like the First Amendment, gay rights, abortion rights, that individual states have policies on those, and then sometimes the Supreme Court will step in and rule on those, or they'll bundle a bunch of state governments and make a ruling for 4 or 5 together that have conflicting laws. I could go on. Marshall Court establishes federal government is the top dog. Little side note, there's a Treaty of 1818. This will come again when we get in a war with Mexico in the 1840s. There's a Treaty of 1818 that, if you see a purple there, top left, where Oregon country would be shared between Americans and the British. Eventually that gets divvied up. You carve out Canada, what will become the states of Washington and Oregon, etc. Probably more detailed story here would be how America took spring break destination capital Florida from the Spanish in the 1800s. So basically, South America having a lot of revolutions. Spain is weakening. They're having troops spread out. There's a lot of natives in Florida. Who controls it has always been kind of up in the air. So in some ways, it's a little ripe for the taking on multiple fronts. So Congress sends in Andrew Jackson, future president, hero from the Battle of New Orleans and the War of 1812, to deal with the hostile Indians in Florida. But Jackson's the type of personality, if you don't know this, if you give him an inch, he's going to take a mile. So he just says, hey, I'm going to seize 2 key posts and take over all of Florida. He takes St. Mark's and Pensacola. And Quincy Adams, I think the president, when this all ends up going down, that might be wrong, maybe it's Monroe, they're like kind of like mad at Jackson for doing this, but then it's also they got Spain in a corner and they can acquire a bunch of land in Florida on the cheap because they have the upper hand, and that's exactly what's going to happen. I think for like $5 million or something like that, Spain cedes Florida in a purchase treaty in 1819. So we're adding states like crazy to the Union. Even before 1820. America is growing exponentially at this time. Almost there. Napoleon over in Europe is going to fall off from power by about 1850. There's going to be kind of a swing back of sorts in Europe to regain kind of control. All this democracy, revolution, Napoleon also types like there's like a profound, we want to get back to how things were energy in Europe. And that's going to make America nervous. Britain is sort of playing the middleman between Europe and the Americas. And this guy named George Canning, who is British's foreign secretary, offers America kind of a weird deal, a weird opportunity. And Britain kind of asked the United States that they would do a hand-in-hand joint declaration that both nations would renounce declaration in land rights in Latin America, that they would both promise that they would acquire no new territory like in the Caribbean and Central America, South America, and that this would be a good way to enter a new era of colonization, or perhaps end the era of colonization with Britain and America. But this is a strange thing. We've just had multiple wars with Britain. Like, why do we need to do this with them? What is London's like logic in doing this? There's worry in American government with this offer of a joint declaration. So that is where you're going to get the all-important term that's known as the Monroe Doctrine, okay? And it comes off of the president, James Monroe. 1823, he gives a very stern warning to the European powers publicly that says there should be no colonization and intervention in North and South America moving forward. Basically, he says You all in Europe need to mind your own freaking business. We'll mind ours. The era of just taking over islands or new territories just for the benefit of the mother country for mercantilism, that era is over. And if you stay out of our way, we'll stay out of yours. Okay, it's a simple declaration. So you can kind of see there the political cartoon, hands off of the United States and the surrounding territory. Nothing else can be claimed. If you already have it, fine, but nothing new with land acquisition. At the same time, we're not going to come over to Europe and meddle in your stuff either. So, part two to this, Europe, generally speaking, is going to be taken aback by this very bold proclamation from a very young country with President Monroe. It's kind of like, are you serious? You're declaring something to our whole continent about how we're supposed to operate as countries. Realistically, the Monroe Doctrine was more about America kind of trying to bluff their way into having self-defense than us trying to have some noble protect South and Central America kind of thing. We're sort of drawing a line in the sand, if you will, as depicted in this political cartoon, and then just hoping that that line in the sand would be protected, but there isn't any weight to that line. And the thing is the Monroe Doctrine, it sounds all fancy and formal. It's not actually the name of a law. It's never a formally significant thing. It's more of a philosophy or an ideology. But oddly enough, over the course of like the rest of this century, that is going to be kind of the staple philosophy of American foreign policy. And it is very reflective and representative of America's kind of growing patriotism and nationalism and independent mindset for this era coming out of that War of 1812. So the Monroe Doctrine, despite it not being this big legal entity, it holds a lot of importance beyond just James Monroe, but for how America's government will operate in the decades moving forward. And just like that, I think we're done with your Chapter 11 notes. Okay, this is all I have for the rest of you today. And then it might just help you have the sub not yell at you. But let's complete a couple of these things before you get out of here. Please remember you're going to have a chapter by yourself, a chapter 10, 11, and 12 reading quiz on study guide knowledge. I suppose that will be on Thursday, your last day before fall break. Do that as homework, the study guide, if you don't choose to do it in class. There is like a 15-question hour if you guys want to do that as a team, if you still like each other at this point. That would be a perfectly fine thing to do. If you get one of those things done and you just kind of need to occupy yourself, feel free. I think there's apps to download or just on the website. You can do an iCivics game kind of thing. And I mentioned at the start of the video, I believe you're out of here at 2:40. I hate that I miss. I like teaching in person. You guys are good kids, but golf is what it is, and we're out for the state finals. We'll be back to normal hopefully next week, and then get ourselves a fall break. Okay? Brennan, don't do anything stupid rest of the period. I'm watching you. Have a good weekend.